After signing a couple of their own players yesterday, the Seahawks were in hibernation on day 2 of the legal tampering period, and several other players went out the door. We'll be breaking down the latest exodus of free agents and looking at the best players available on our Tuesday edition of Locked On Seahawks.
You are Locked On Seahawks, your daily Seattle Seahawks podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Greetings, 12. This is Corbin Smith, host of the Locked On Seahawks podcast, your daily Seahawks podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Glad to be joined on our Tuesday episode by my co-host in crime, Rob Rang, who is back in his normal habitat today for the show. Looking forward to breaking down free agency, and a special thanks, as always, to all the 12s out there. Whether you're listening in Sumner, Washington, or down in Amarillo, Texas, we greatly appreciate each and every one of you making Locked On Seahawks your first listen 5 days a week. It has been a snail-paced day for the Seahawks and free agency. No new signings, still one of two teams with no outside free agent signed to this point. Probably will sign somebody while we are live on the show here, Rob, but no activity up to this point. We'll be diving into what went down on day 2. We'll be answering your mailbag questions on a special Tuesday mailbag, and diving into the best available free agents going into the first official day of free agency. This episode is brought to you by FanDuel. Make every moment more. Right now, new customers get $200 in bonus bets with any winning $5 bet. That's $200 if your first bet wins. Visit FanDuel.com/lockedon to get started. Now for your lead story here on our Tuesday edition of Locked On Seahawks. John Schneider has been known for being slow at the beginning of free agency and playing the patient card, but this year might be the most stressful for fans because the Seahawks have yet to sign an outside free agent, with the legal tampering period about to end and free agency to officially begin tomorrow morning. Rob, I know that there's a lot of stress out there for fans seeing all the players that are leaving. Damien Lewis going to Carolina, Drew Lock leaving for the New York Giants, DeeJay Dallas getting a 3-year deal with the Arizona Cardinals today, and no signings to come to the Seahawks in return. To this point, it has really been an exodus of players and not much activity from Schneider and company.
Well, that's very true. At the same time, I would argue that, Drew Lock was a backup. DeeJay Dallas was a backup. Both got paid very, very well for their services here. And Damien Lewis, it was a contract that I think that, hey, look, I certainly wish him well in Carolina. The Carolina Panthers, my goodness, they are just throwing money around at the guard position like crazy. I think that it is a little bit concerning, certainly for Seahawks fans. I understand that concern, but at the same time, as you said in the opening, Corbin, this is something that John Schneider has done in the past. Just because the Seahawks have some financial flexibility here doesn't mean that you want to spend all willy-nilly. I think there's going to be some conversations between Schneider and his scouts, and of course Mike McDonald and his coaches, about what exactly are they prioritizing. I do think if you want to play the critical card here, then I think that maybe the Seahawks have been surprised by how bold some of the other clubs out there have been, especially at the linebacker position. It is a little concerning, certainly, when if you look at the depth chart right now for the Seahawks, and it's basically Drake Thomas and Patrick O'Connell right now would be your starting inside linebackers, at least if the Seahawks were to play a game tomorrow. But of course, they're not. And much like how I was, kind of preaching caution when the Seahawks initially brought in some guy named Pete Carroll to be head coach, and we thought, hey, give the man a little bit of time. His track record of success, especially in the secondary, speaks for itself. So allow the man to be able to draft some players that are going to fit into his system. Same thing here. I would argue that while I don't love this linebacker crop in terms of the rookies, I do think that you have to trust what Mike McDonald has been able to do. And that is where I do think that you're going to see Seattle kind of lean on his experience and expertise, and perhaps go with some linebackers, some safeties that fit into his defense, rather than just basically playing fantasy football here with very real money.
I wrote an article about this earlier today. We know that John Schneider and the front office for the Seahawks, generally, this is how they operate. They are not going to get involved in bidding wars. And to an extent, I agree with that strategy. Like when guards that are not Pro Bowl caliber players are getting $19, $20 million per year, yeah, you want to probably stay out of those bids. You're going to be throwing money that you're eventually going to regret. A lot of these free agent deals that happen right out of the gates, that's what happened. Guys a year or two later are out in free agency again. It happens more times than not. So I understand that. But I also think you pointed this out, and I wrote this in my article today. This feels different than the other times, not just because you have a new coach that is in the saddle, but it just seems like free agency has been accelerated. And I think that caught John Schneider flat-footed, especially because everything this offseason has been delayed because they were hiring a new coaching staff. I mean, their negotiations with their own free agents started later than usual. So I think they got behind the eight ball a little bit. And the expectation is, well, the second wave of free agency isn't going to happen until a few days after the first day of free agency. The players they would normally wait on, the Jeremy Chins of the world, are signing one-year contracts for $5 million on the second day of the legal tampering period. And I think that type of stuff is catching John Schneider in the front office off guard, because that's not normally how it happens. You're normally going to see the big deals the first 2 or 3 days, maybe even 4, and then you start to phase into that next phase where younger players that are on prove-it deals, you start to see those guys get contracts. There's been a bunch of guys sign one-year deals today across the league, none of them with the Seahawks. So, Rob, I especially at the linebacker and safety spots, 2 huge needs for the Seahawks. I look at the players flying off the board. A lot of these players in last year's free agent crop wouldn't have had a contract probably until the 3rd or 4th day of free agency. They have an agreement in place before free agency actually starts this year. So I think the timing is what makes this all feel different. And I don't think the Seahawks, whether it's fair or not, I don't think that they were ready for that. And so now they're in this position where I bet behind the scenes there is a little bit of scrambling, because you're thinking, man, there was some safeties and linebackers we had some interest in. And you look at the price points too. It isn't just Jordan Brooks yesterday for $10 million. You look at some of these other players going off the board. I mean, Jeremy Chin was available. The Commanders signed him for $5 million. And I know for a fact that the Seahawks had interest there. So something is getting lost in translation from a timing standpoint. And the Seahawks just have been out of the race in a number of these possible signings at this point. And so I do think it's a little different than normal.
I think that it's possible that that the Seahawks were interested in say a player like a Jeremy Chin. I also think that there are a number of safeties. That's the position we want to focus in on here for a minute, that I still believe are available that would make an awful lot of sense. I mean, we talked during yesterday's show, and you know, the Seahawks have already basically publicly said that they are not ruling out the possibility of bringing back a player like a Quandre Diggs. But you mentioned Jeremy Chin and the fact that he signed with Washington. Washington is choosing to go with Chin over a quality safety, in my opinion, in Cameron Curl, that is still available. Justin Simmons is, of course, the biggest name that's out there. Julian Blackmon, Jordan Fuller, Rayshon Jenkins. I mean, there's a lot of safeties. To me, that is one of the richest positions that's still available in free agency. And so I'm not overly concerned about the safety position. Linebacker, I am a little bit concerned. Certainly left guard, again, replacing Damien Lewis is, not for the faint of heart in terms of who is still available. There still are some big names out there, but most of them are north of 30 years old. And that has not been something that John Schneider has prioritized in the past. So that's where it does feel like Seattle maybe is not as focused on free agency as perhaps some of the other clubs out there. It does feel like this is a team that I think, because of the new coaching staff, is basically kind of building for the long haul. The fact that I saw myself at the University of Oregon Pro Day today, that the Seahawks were well represented there. 4 different members of their scouting and coaching staff that were there. That to me feels like where the Seahawks are focusing. Criticize them if you'd like. I'm sure there's going to be lots of Seahawks fans who are. But again, because they have a new head coach and entirely new staff here, basically in the coaching side of things, I do think that it is going to take some time, but I think that they're they're going to be playing the long game. There's an old expression in golf, putt for show, drive for show, putt for dough. It feels like the Seahawks are basically lining up their putts right now rather than trying to show off how far they can drive the ball.
And I get that rationale. I typically am on the side of being cautious early in free agency because the data is there. The teams that spend big bucks early, they're usually spending those big bucks because they're not good. And so I understand that rationale. But I also look at the players that are getting signed right now, Rob, and I'm sitting back here like, okay, who's left at linebacker that you can bring in? Unless you're wanting to bring Bobby Wagner back, which we'll talk about later, that may very well be what they end up doing. But there's been some solid linebackers that have been available that they could have gotten at a reasonable price, and they didn't sign any of them. And you can only fill so many holes in one draft, especially when you have 46 players signed on the roster like the Seahawks do right now. So I can understand why some fans are frustrated too because of the way that free agency is gone. And some of the guys that are flying off the board that, as I said, in other years, they might have still been looking for a contract. They're already signed and taken. So this has been a different, much more expedited process. And I just don't know that the Seahawks were necessarily prepared for that. And it could have just been because they had a new coaching staff and all those changes just made it impossible for them to be as ready as usual. So who knows? But we'll talk about the best available free agents later in the show. There's still plenty of talent out there, as you said, especially at the safety position. We'll discuss that later. But first, we got to get to our mailbag segment. The Seahawks were nice today. Maybe this is why they didn't sign anybody. They wanted us to answer listener questions. We're going to sneak it in here on our Tuesday episode of Locked On Seahawks. This episode is brought your way by FanDuel. Say goodbye to busted brackets because FanDuel lets you bet on every game of the tourney with March Madness officially underway. Whether you're betting on a big upset like Fairleigh Dickinson last year, upsetting Purdue, or a 1 seed, it's time to go dancing. Sports new customers get $200 in bonus bets if your $5 bet wins. That's $200 to use on point spreads, money lines. You can even pick who's going to win it all. Whether you think it's going to be a blue blood like Kansas or North Carolina or a Cinderella, maybe you got a 16 seed getting to the Elite Eight. All options are on the table at your fingertips. Just visit FanDuel.com/lockedon and bet on college hoops until they cut down the nets. You're listening to the Tuesday edition of Locked On Seahawks. This is your host, Corbin Smith. Glad to be joined, as always, by my co-host in crime, Rob Rang. And a special thanks to each and every one of the 12s for tuning in on this Tuesday evening and making Locked On Seahawks your first listen 5 days a week. We greatly appreciate it. It's time to get in our weekly mailbag. We had to switch up the schedule with all the craziness of the first day of the legal tampering period yesterday. But the Seahawks gave us a reprieve today without signing any players. So we get to tackle your questions. And Rob, we've got some fun ones here. Our first one for you, good sir, coming from Tony in Montana. With the higher demand signings at guard and tight end, do you think it is more important than ever for Seattle to trade down and pick up more draft capital in April?
I think if this process through free agency continues the way that it has to this point, then yes, Tony in Montana, I do think that is a strong possibility. Just because, again, I think that the depth of this year's draft sets up very nicely for Seattle's current positions of concern. We've talked so many times about how offensive line is really a strength, tight end is really a strength. There is not an inside linebacker, in my opinion, worthy of number 16 overall. I've said it before, I'll say it again. My favorite inside linebacker, traditional 3-4 thumper of an inside linebacker in this draft class happens to be Michigan's Junior Colson, who, of course, Mike McDowell is going to know very, very well. I think he is more of a solid second round prospect, and Seattle, of course, doesn't currently have a second round selection. So, yes, again, Tony Montana, I think that that you are anticipating the way that Seattle may attack this roster rebuild, frankly, rather than being aggressive and trading up, as some have suggested, or staying pat number 16, trading back down and filling some of these holes with the kind of prospects that are young, hungry, and inexpensive, I think makes the most sense for the Seahawks.
First question for me. This is a fun one from Derek Spoon. Do you think you can run on a treadmill while recording the podcast to heighten the possibility of the Seahawks doing something while you record. While I appreciate the question, I'll tell you, I have went running a few times this offseason with my phone out ready to record a video while I was running. If you think just running by itself is fatiguing, try it holding a phone out, trying to film yourself. I did that when Mike McDonald's hiring was announced while I was running. And yes, this has become a true spectacle. I don't know what it is, Rob. It dates back to before I was a reporter when Percy Harvin was traded during the 2014 season, and I still lived in Indiana. I was out running, and Percy Harvin got traded during that time period. The Jamal Adams trade happened when I was running. There have been several other trades. Quandre Diggs trade happened, the Mike McDonald hiring. And yesterday, they didn't have anything happen while I was running, but within 5 minutes after I got back, the first signing was announced that Noah Fant was returning. So you're welcome, Seahawks fans. But no, I will not be doing a podcast on a treadmill. I don't think Rob would appreciate that. And I don't feel like throwing up while I'm doing a podcast. It doesn't sound overly enticing. Next question for Rob. Seems like the Seahawks are losing some important leadership pieces with all the changes. Is that accurate? And if so, does it concern you guys? This is from Catman Did on X.
I think anytime that you are losing veterans, then you have to have some concern about that. But those were veterans, those were leaders that, again, had been built up during the Pete Carroll era. And there's a new sheriff in town, obviously, in Mike McDonald. So while I have some concern about that, I'd like to think that there's going to be some new young leaders that are going to basically take that next step forward. And so I think that retain a player like Leonard Williams, for example, I think is critical. I think that we are forgetting what a leader that Uchenna Nwosu was for the Seahawks. And obviously going down with the injury a year ago sapped some of that ability. I think the leadership that Devin Witherspoon showed, even as a rookie, I think is just infectious. And then again, Mike McDonald coming in, that is your leader that I think that the Seahawks are going to be building around. So yes, it is concerning, but at the same time, I think that just because they're familiar to fans doesn't necessarily mean that they're actually leaders in the locker room. And I say that with all due respect. I think that Bobby Wagner and Quandre Diggs in particular were two absolute terrific leaders for this club, but they are still free agents that might be making their way back to Seattle. It just remains to be seen.
Next question here coming from Harvey A23. With most of the Justin Fields suitors, and this is in quotes, having sorted out their QB situation today, do you think Justin Fields to the Seahawks is a realistic possibility? And do you want to see that happen? So this is a two-pronged question. Is it a possibility? This is John Schneider we're talking about. John Schneider never leaves a stone unturned. And maybe the lack of free agency moves, maybe that suggests that the team is thinking towards 2025, 2026, who their next quarterback is going to be, rather than trying to stock up around Geno Smith in the present. I don't necessarily agree with that strategy, but that may be what they are doing right now, Rob. And if that's the case, then it might make some sense if Justin Fields is available for a third or fourth round pick to consider doing that, because he is an immensely talented player and has that running ability, still young. But personally, I think that it's hard to envision that this would be the team that Justin Fields ends up on. And I'm not sure where he ends up at this point, where he's going to have an opportunity to be a starter, because a lot of the other teams that haven't picked a quarterback yet pick early in the draft. So they're going to be getting their own guys through the draft and a pretty good quarterback class. I don't know where he ends up as far as whether I want it to happen or not. You know, if you could get him at an affordable rate, not have to give up much in draft compensation, then maybe it would make sense. But I don't want to trade draft picks for a backup quarterback. I just don't. You know, even if you think he's going to be your starter down the line, I don't like that logic. I'm not doing what the Jaguars did, trading a 6th round pick for Mac Jones. I'm saving that draft pick to get somebody else that I hope is going to be playing, and I can sign a backup quarterback off the free agent market. That's just my viewpoint. Our next question for Rob. I really like new coaching staff, but also loved Pete Carroll. When the front office made the decision to relieve him of his head coaching duties, it was reported he'd take on a new role with the organization. Was that just spin selling? This coming from Jason Shepard on X.
You know, I think that it was. A little bit of spin selling, to be honest with you. I don't know that for a fact. I have not asked Pete Carroll that. I've not asked the Seahawks scouts and coaches that I've gotten to know since the turnover. But I do believe that Pete Carroll has other interests and definitely wants to stay, out of the way. I think he wants, I shouldn't say stay out of the way. I think that he wants John Schneider to get this opportunity. Carroll has said as much. I think that Carroll also recognizes that Mike McDonald needs to kind of have his own opportunity here to do something new and fresh in Seattle. And, Pete Carroll being anywhere associated with the club is just going to confuse things a little bit. The players are still going to view him as a head coach. They're still going to go to him. And I think that it can be a distraction, frankly. So I think that Pete Carroll recognizes that. I think that the Seahawks as a franchise, as an organization, that they want Pete Carroll to be as involved as he wants to, because they appreciate what a Hall of Fame resume that he has helped put together in Seattle, and obviously brought the only Lombardi trophy to the Seahawks. But I would be surprised if Pete Carroll has any type of formal role with the Seahawks moving forward. I think it's more kind of similar to Mike Holmgren, with reverence rather than as somebody who is actually getting a check or has any type of real role in the organization moving forward.
Wrapping up our mailbag from Landis3254 on Threads. Could Seattle's lack of activity be a result of waiting for the LA Chargers to cut a bunch of dudes? Now, some might laugh at this question, but I actually think there's some plausibility to this, because the Chargers right now are in a really bad spot with their salary cap. There's been a lot of rumors floating around about Joey Bosa or Khalil Mack potentially being available in the trade market, but teams are just waiting for them to cut. The leverage is on the other team's side. So the Chargers at some point are going to have to make some moves, because their cap situation is not good. They're not going to be able to build a roster they want with Jim Harbaugh as a coach. So they're going to have to cut some players loose that they haven't done so to this point. And there's a strong possibility that Bosa and or Khalil Mack are both going to be on the market if nobody's willing to trade for them. And I could see the Seahawks having interest in either one of those guys if they hit the market. The Chargers could release some other players as well that have some interest from the Seahawks. So I don't know that this means this is a surefire thing that's going to happen, but this really speaks in general. There are going to be a lot of teams after spending big money. They're going to be like, wait, our cap situation now isn't good. Let's cut a few guys. There's always cuts middle of free agency. There might be some good players that hit the market that the Seahawks are interested in, that at that point they can get at a bargain price. So I do think that this is a viable question in terms with the Chargers. Up next, we're going to be heading into the first official day of free agency tomorrow. Which players are still out there that could help the Seahawks, especially at linebacker and safety? We're going to dive in coming up next here on our Tuesday edition of Locked On Seahawks. Locked On Seahawks is sponsored by BetterHelp. What's the first thing you'd do if you had an extra hour in your day? For me, I wish I had a little bit more time to paint and create artwork. The best way to squeeze that special thing into your schedule is to know what's important to you and make it a priority. Therapy can help you find what matters to you so you can do more of it. BetterHelp Online Therapy will assess your needs. It can match you with your own licensed professional therapist in less than 48 hours. If you're thinking of starting therapy, give BetterHelp a try. It's entirely online. It's designed to be convenient, flexible, and suited to your schedule. Just fill out a brief questionnaire to get matched with a licensed therapist and switch therapists at any time for no additional charge. Learn to make time for what makes you happy with BetterHelp. Get 10% off your first month at BetterHelp.com/lockedon. That's 10% off your first month of online therapy at BetterHelp.com/lockedon. You're listening to the Tuesday edition of Locked On Seahawks. I'm your host, Corbin Smith. Glad to be joined, as always, by my co-host in crime, Rob Rang. And a special thanks to each and every one of the 12s tuning in on this Tuesday night. Thank you for making Locked On Seahawks your first listen 5 days a week. We greatly appreciate it. The last 2 days, it has been the legal tampering period, which always makes me laugh because I just feel like they should just, on Monday, just start free agency. Like, these teams have been talking to agents for weeks. What's the point of the tampering period? But anyway, that is still the way that they structure it. So we're going to be wrapping that up today, which means Free agency for real starts tomorrow. All these reported contracts are going to get signed, or at least most of them. We've seen a few instances where players had deals and they ended up backing out, or a physical got failed. There have been some examples of that happening. So who knows what craziness we'll see tomorrow. With that said, there's still plenty of free agents out there for teams like the Seahawks to consider, especially since Seattle currently has 46 players on the roster. They got to get some players on this roster. And there's certainly some big needs. Rob, I want to start at the linebacker position because, as you mentioned in the first quarter, that is really the position group that I'm most concerned about with the Seahawks right now, because you literally have Patrick O'Connell and you have Drake Thomas, and nobody else is signed. Those two players were undrafted rookies last year. Neither one of them has started an NFL game. They barely played in an NFL game. Thomas is coming off an injury. And you look at the linebacker crop in free agency, it's been plucked pretty clean to this point. A lot of the players we've speculated the Seahawks have interest in, whether it's a high-priced guy like Patrick Queen, bringing back Jordan Brooks. There's been a number of guys that have been plucked off the free agent wire. There's just not a lot of options that are still out there.
There's not. And, of course, the most recognizable name that's out there is Bobby Wagner. And I just don't know at this point in his career, Corbin, that he is the kind of linebacker that you want taking on guards and, discarding him at the line of scrimmage and then blowing up running backs in the hole. That's not his game. He's still a linebacker that is more of a hit and run kind of a guy. Devin White is very similar in that way. Those of you who can see the list here that Corbin has put up, watch on YouTube, thank you as always. But I mean, you look at this list of linebackers, and almost all of them are going to be less than 230 pounds. And you really want guys who are going to be 240 plus. They're going to be as thick in their lower half as they are in their upper half. And that's just not a long list. There was only a couple of them in the initial free agent list. Frankie Louvu, who I believe actually wound up going to Washington, was one of the few linebackers on this list that was a free agent that I did think might have made, from a schematic standpoint, some sense for Seattle. So where they go, I mean, I think that you're looking at guys like a Devin White, which would be a big home run kind of a hit. Home run kind of a signing just because of the big name. But he is a player that has struggled a little bit with consistency. Certainly Bobby Wagner, I think that he can buy you another year, maybe even two. But still, that's the kind of contract that we're talking about. Tyrell Dodson is a player from Buffalo that I'm a little bit intrigued by as well. But still, this is a relatively short list. And that's one of the reasons why I think that what has happened so far in free agency suggests that the Seahawks may be focusing their attention at linebacker in the 2024 NFL draft.
And I made the pitch for Kenneth Murray yesterday, another one of those guys coming from the Chargers, that he's a little bit lighter, but he's heavier than most of the guys that are on that list. Your Isaiah Simmonses of the world that the Seahawks know well from playing against in his time in Arizona, and he has not lived up to his top 10 draft billing. Had a rough lone season with the Giants, but he's still a young guy with a lot of athleticism. Maybe he could be a Kyle Hamilton type chess piece in Mike McDonald's defense. I mean, there are some guys on the market that would make sense. Some of our listeners are going to laugh when I say this, but maybe this paints the picture for you. I think Cody Barton is one of the 7 best linebackers that's left in free agency right now. When you consider his youth, his athleticism, the fact he started a lot of games, that tells you where things are at. I don't think that he's a great starter by any means, but that's how much things have been trimmed down. I mean, you can bring in somebody like a Jerome Baker that has started a lot of games for Miami, but he's 225 pounds. He is not that big linebacker that I think you're going to need in a 3-4 defense. Even though Baker played in a 3-4 in Miami and was productive, there's a reason they just cut it. He's been an inconsistent player, particularly in coverage. So I just look at this list and I think bringing back Bobby Wagner right now makes as much sense as anything, because there's a lot of question marks with most of the players that are on this list, and Bobby Wagner can still make plays, maybe not as an every down linebacker, but as you said, it affords you time to get those guys that are going to be every down linebackers in the draft, because I don't think there are many guys in this draft at that position that are going to be ready to play on defense day one. I just don't. So having somebody like Bobby Wagner that can also fill that leadership role makes a lot of sense. Now, when you look at the safety position, as you mentioned earlier, I do feel like there are a lot of names that still would make sense for Seattle. Justin Simmons is starting to get some buzz from a few teams, the Tennessee Titans being one that I most recently saw have interest in him. former All-Pro. He's only 30 years old, so he's still young enough that I think he's got a couple good years left in him. He would make some sense. I've raved about Julian Blackmon. I can't believe he has not signed a contract yet. A guy that has started a lot of games. He's only 25 years old. Another former Seahawk. I mean, we talked about this yesterday. I think Quandre Diggs is one of the better safeties that's remaining on the market. You've got guys like Jordan Whitehead and Cameron Curl who are younger players, but I just don't think that they have the ball skills and don't necessarily fit this scheme as well as what Quandre Diggs would. And then there's players like Eddie Jackson, who was a Pro Bowler and All-Pro for the Bears, but he has really declined the last couple of years. I don't know that a change of scenery at his age is necessarily going to bring him back to his glory days. Maybe he can be a solid stopgap starter for you, but once you get to about 6 or 7 there, you're starting to look at some guys that are maybe 1 or 2 year solutions. Quandre Diggs is probably going to be in that mix if you're bringing him back, but there's not a lot of players under 30 years old that are left in the market unless you're looking at somebody like a Julian Blackmon.
That's true. I really would be intrigued by a guy like a Blackmon or a Jordan Whitehead, for example. I mentioned Cameron Curl before. The Seahawks have been linked to Rayshawn Jenkins from the Jaguars. All 4 of those players have the youth and enough playmaking ability, not only at the NFL level, but the college level, that I think would make some sense. Of course, we talked a lot about Quandre Diggs, a possible return. This is not a elite safety class in terms of the draft, so I do expect the Seahawks to find a veteran here. But I also think that we got to look at some of the players that are currently on Seattle's roster, just like we did at the inside linebacker position, and a player that we haven't talked enough about is Kobe Bryant. Jarek Reed II, of course, coming off of the injury, but we were intrigued by what he had demonstrated. I mean, he was, at one point, he was probably Seattle's best special teams defender. And that is something that the Seahawks in the past have kind of used as like a springboard to getting them onto the starting unit on defense. And so I wouldn't be surprised if the Seahawks feel comfortable with Reed's recovery, that they might be positioning him for a possibility as a starter. So again, there are some intriguing options at that spot. And again, I think you have to trust what Mike McDonald was able to do before. Geno Stone wasn't viewed as a star until this past season when he wound up being one of the NFL's best pass thieves. So again, I think that you just have to kind of trust the process a little bit. To me, the more interesting conversation really kind of switches over to the guard spot. Just because Damien Lewis, again, is the guard that I think that Seattle was hoping to get him back. I think that there are some guys that would make some sense. Kevin Zeitler is the big name, and of course, Mike McDonald's going to know him very well. Zeitler was with the Ravens here. He's older, though. I believe he's 34 years old at this point. So there's a player down the board a little bit more, Connor Williams, as well as Dalton Reisner. These are guys that have played both left and right sides going back to their college days, both guard and tackle. That type of positional and positional flexibility, I think, is going to be intriguing to the Seahawks at this point. And again, I think that guard is very likely to be Seattle's top priority in this draft class at this point. And I think that their inaction or action thus far in free agency suggests that is the case.
There's a couple other edge guys. I've thrown Jadeveon Clowney's name out, and he's still the one that I think would be the best fit because we've already seen him play in Mike McDonald's defense and what he did last year in Baltimore. He's played in Seattle. He's familiar with the VMAC and what the Seahawks as an organization stand for. He understands that he would be able to mesh right away for those reasons. But a couple names out there, they're different stages of their career. Emmanuel Ogbah just got cut by the Dolphins, but he's a solid run defender, more of a base defensive end. He's had some quality seasons as a pass rusher. He could fill that gap as another it's somewhat inexpensive guy that you could add off edge that could rotate in, and he would be a better run defender than what you've gotten from Darrell Taylor the last 3 years. And then, of course, there's Chase Young out there, and he's drawing a lot of interest. I don't know if the Seahawks have looked in on that, but we know John Schneider has a history where he likes to bring in former top first-round picks if they are available. He likes to take a chance on those guys. And Chase Young's had some productivity when he's played. There's also been some injuries. There's been some questions about him defending the run at times. He's been very inconsistent, but he is still only 24 years old. So both those names would make some sense. I want to throw one more name out there that I put him in the trenches because he plays a lot in the trenches. There's not a lot of tight ends out there that I think are going to be impact players to bring in right now on the free agent market. CJ Uzama is a 31-year-old tight end, so he's not a spring chicken, but he has been a really good run blocker for most of his career, and I think he's a better receiver. He only had 8 receptions last year and a touchdown. He was hindered as much as anybody by the fact that Aaron Rodgers got hurt. Just suddenly wasn't a part of their passing game, and their offensive line was so bad they needed him to come in and help block a lot of the time. But he has been a sneaky good receiver for most of his career when he was in Cincinnati. That is a good stopgap tight end to put with Noah Fant that I don't think is going to be expensive to sign because of his age. There have been a few injuries, but I think his receiving ability, his blocking ability, you bring a rookie in to round out that group, that tight end group has a chance to be pretty solid despite the losses of Colby Parkinson and Will Dissly.
I 100% agree with you. I think that the tight end room in terms of free agency, I think there's still some intriguing names out there. And again, that is where I would try to caution Seahawks fans from freaking out right now is I think that Seattle's top 2 priorities were Leonard Williams and Noah Fant. I think that's the reason why that, frankly, when I had some conversations with some Seahawks guys at that Oregon Pro Day today, Corbin, they were walking around confident, not freaking out. And so I think that, again, they felt like they needed to just bring back a couple of their best players that were about to hit the open market. And I feel that they thought that they did that, and it was basically mission accomplished at this point.
As always, you can follow me on X and Threads at Corbin Smith NFL. You can follow Rob at Rob Rang. Make sure to subscribe to Locked On Seahawks on YouTube or wherever you listen to your podcast to make sure you don't miss a single episode. When we come back tomorrow, we're hoping that there will actually be some positive moves. The Seahawks will bring in some new players on the first day of free agency. We'll be breaking all that down on our latest episode. Make sure to listen in and enjoy the rest of your Tuesday night. Go Hawks.